Hello, Monica here. I wanted to talk to you guys about two different styles of magics. I watched this video with this guy who is in the Theosophical Society, and he talks about two different theories of magic and basically, how to get what you want. But I first just have to say that the entire lecture was based on his own personal experience, as every person will attest when trying to talk about these things. You can only talk about your own personal experiences. And every one of his was like the model basically like, whoa, 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 whoa. Watch out what you're messing with because you never know the results you're going to get. I think that there's a reason for that. I think it has to do specifically with a magician or person, a person's essentially level of spiritual merit. I don't like that term, but it's a concept that you'll come across in a lot of spiritual traditions. That basically, by either the simple version of it is doing good deeds, helping other people, acting in a way that is service to something greater than you, so maybe the Buddha, whatever. And just doing things in a certain way that sets up certain karmic and dharmic spiritual conditions so that after a certain level of that type of spiritual practice, you reach a certain level of spiritual merit. And when you have reached that level, then you can do things that don't go so terribly awry. That's just one part of what I want to talk about. So the two styles of magics that this guy talks about are the old style of magic, which was basically there are all these weird unseen spirits and forces. They don't really have the same type of consciousness that we do, not self-aware, not self-reflecting, discursive consciousness, which is somewhat analytical and blah blah blah. That's the train that we've been developing for a while, the yang current of our brains. uh, and that may or may not have their own agenda, and they might no, I said it like that. They might have varying amounts or degrees of power. They might not want to be controlled by you. And the old style of magics is basically calling upon this spirit, I call thee forth and bind thee, and you bind the spirit to your will, and then it's forced to do the things that you want to do, and then you have all this extra power, to accomplish your intention and your will in the universe and create these things and make them happen. The idea is creating a servitor or an egregore, which is something that is going to do your bidding, Uh, and then, of course, he talks about these different types of disembodied consciousness don't really want to do your thing, so that's where all the binding comes in. This is basically servitude. It really seems old style stuff to me, Like, I have dealt with entities, I've created entities before, and they can be totally fine. I'm not exactly sure why this spirit magics always ends up always ends up in this sort of egoic battle of well, just battle of egos, I could just say. In that that disembodied separate type of consciousness of the spirit or whatever has some independent form for itself, and that essentially you are at odds with that form, or your ego is at odds with that form, and you're trying to bend it to your will. Because let's face it, no one that has any amount of independent consciousness wants to be enslaved by anything. So the idea was that you couldn't affect things in the astral realms, let's just call it that, or the ether, or whatever, uh, to do magics to affect the real world eventually, unless you had this extra form of power. And you got that extra form of power by working with weird spirits, right? Then the commentator that I was listening to goes on to describe several different experiences in which people, let's see, he mentions this one, in which this guy who was completely destitute, had no money, no job, and no hope, and he decided to do a spell to invoke or evoke a powerful spirit that was going to get him his money back, get his life back. And it was this old spirit that he found, and it had the form of a horse or something like that. And I'll try to just sum up the story as fast as possible. Basically, it worked. He invokes his spirit, has a sigil, and realizes somehow during the ritual, or the spirit like tells him somehow or something, that he has to keep the sigil in a very precious place forever. So he attaches it to his favorite guitar, which he's never going to let out of sight, you know. Mistake number one. And as soon as he's done with the ritual, basically, there's a knock at the door. He opens the door, and his friend is like, hey, my car is on my last leg. I don't need it anymore. I'm just going to give it to you. So, like, the bottom's falling out of it, but it runs. So he's able to use the car to go around town looking for jobs, gets a job the first place he's at, moves up in like less than a month's time to a managerial position, starts making good money, moves up in the company again, goes somewhere else, and you know, it's just all the stuff happens in the right way. Then he completely forgets where the sigil is. He lets someone borrow the guitar because they either want to like fix it for him or tune it up or something like that. And then suddenly he hears about the guy opened the guitar, found the sigil, didn't know what it was, just tosses it away. And then he's driving back to like give this guy the guitar, and he ends up going to a racetrack. He's never been to a racetrack. He doesn't like horses. He doesn't care, but he goes there, and he's just enthralled with the horses that he sees. Like, he just falls in love with the whole thing. Ends up losing all of his money at the racetracks and completely destroying his life. So that's like warning caveat number one about, you know, don't mess with these things because you never really know what they're gonna do. The other example is, of course, a person who is, it's always based on money in our society, and it sucks that way, but, you know, I've done it too. You get really desperate, and that's when you suddenly turn to magic. You know, it's just how it works. It's how we suddenly turn to everything when we're, you know, destitute or desperate or a little bit low. We say, oh, you know, that's when we start praying and having faith again, isn't it? The other example is somebody needed exactly $10,000 and a very specific spell, 10,000, I need it right now, and everything in her car gets stolen, and the insurance payout is exactly $10,000. That's a much shorter example of basically like you don't know how it's going to happen. In studying chaos magic, it's always if I say I win $1 million by the end of the year, or something like that. You put a time limit on it; it's right there. So it's got a lot of time to build up that energy and for everything to happen. And then your rich aunt dies and leaves you $1 million. You know. So it's not like, oh yeah, you killed her or whatever. It's just these are always unintended consequences. It's just nobody exactly knows how this stuff is going to work. I don't like that anymore. First of all, I do think that it has to do with this idea of spiritual merit, but I also think that it has to do with just knowing that. Accepting these possibilities that your magics are going to fly around anywhere, and so you try, don't just try, you have to edit yourself. You have to go through this process of self editing and self reflection and go deep, 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 deep down. Why am I really doing this? Is this what I really need? Do I care if one of my relatives, you know, has an accident and suddenly is able to, you know, like that kind of thing? And then your conceptions around specific things like that, that's really always out of my control anyway. I'm not doing spells to bind or protect all of my loved ones from ever having any accidents now. So how am I really responsible for that? You know, you have to think about these things. You have to self-edit. It's basically the process of confession. This is one thing I will constantly take from not Catholicism, although it is quite Christianish based. There are other precedents for confession, and there are other reasons for it. I will take it from the Obermelin, the operation of Obermelin the Mage. pare it down, one of the really important things for it is the process of confession. This is not going and sitting before a priest who's, it's just a man. Nobody cares. Um, this is confessing to yourself, or putting yourself in front of your altar space or wherever you practice, maybe even out in the forest or something like that, and nature. Confess to the mountain, whatever moves you the most. There's this whole process in the Obermelon of inflaming yourself in devotion and stuff like that, which is great, because emotion has a lot of power. So you basically think like, what have I done that I know has hurt people? What have I done recently? Or whatever comes up. When I started doing this, I went all the way back to my childhood. I'm like, I'm going to think about it. Ah, shit. I threw egg on that girl because that guy told me to, and we were little, and it was stupid. You know, I lied to my mother when I did this, and blah, blah, blah. And you don't just go through it like cursorily. You go through it, and it's like, well, does that really matter? Am I like holding on to these ideas? I'm like, oh, yeah, that was so bad. When it really did not matter that much. If you can get through that, that's great. And then the stuff that really does matter, and the stuff that you're like, I should never have said that to Jolene or whoever, whatever. And really, really work with that. That's something you should be doing anyway. Actually, have like left that at the door recently. I would love to go back there. Start using that again. It really opens things up, loosens them, detaches weird stuff. This is another process of cleansing and getting to a place of high spiritual merit so that you can. This is the point of that whole conversation and that whole rant there, so that you can affect the ether in a pure way. Look at your intention. Why do I want this? Does it stem from simple desire? Is it an egoic desire? Is it a simple reaction to the fact that I have no money right now and bill creditors are knocking at my door? Is it all emotionally based? Am I just in fear? Blah, 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 blah. And even if you are, it doesn't matter. You just have to know. You just have to go through and know. And believe me, you'll never know every little thing. You could spend 10 years examining one little action or desire with a therapist and probably never flesh out every single little thing that was involved with it, right? But try. Try to get to it. I think that this really, excuse me, I think that this really circumvents a lot of bad stuff. People who talk about this type of magic, and believe me, this is exactly the same thing as and I'll get to this other one in a minute, it's basically the exact same thing as the positive thinking movement, which basically developed into the more new agey manifestation of your desires movement. Everything should be, yeah. So let's just talk about that. It's the other style of magic is basically based off of Blavatsky, who was like the whole, I say this a lot, like she is the grandmother of the New Age philosophy. She would probably hate that, but because there are a lot of things that disagree, and that is just a bunch of fluff around that whole clique called the New Age movement or whatever. And believe me, most New Agers do not have a complete manifesto that they all sync up on. It's a hodgepodge of a bunch of different ideas, and some people, they just latch on to what sounds pretty to them and then they move on. So the whole positive thinking movement, basically, to me, in my mind, became the manifestation movement, which is basically that if you put enough energy into a certain intention, it will manifest. This is the same model as the chaos movement and chaos magic movement, which is you have a desire, you create a form of that desire, specifically in a picture, a sigil, a fetish doll, art. That's one of the most beautiful ways to do it. Just art, painting, drawing, whatever your thing is. Get some crayons and make your desire, And then you fire that desire into the ether, into the universe. People like to say universe these days, I don't know why. And then the universe is somehow going to take that desire and it's going to do its things, it's going to get the other energies that it needs, and it's going to come back. And eventually, it will affect the manifest physical world, right? That's the new model. That's the new model of magics that this commentator was also talking about. Still with the idea that you probably shouldn't because you never know what's going to happen. That's the idea that I really want to get away from, because I really feel that in the new style of magics, that's going to be happening less and less and less and less and less. And it's not just a matter of being so pure with your intention, it is a matter of us being the new creatures now. This old style, these old paradigms, people are always talking about the old spiritual paradigms, was one of sacrifice and just sacrifice, you know? Everything has a price, Sabrina. You know, that kind of thing. Um, and I don't agree. Yes, it has a price, and the price should be how much energy you are willing to put into that thing. I just want to tell you a story, and this is light as I can get with this stuff. Simply sitting in front of my altar for like 2 minutes or less, uh, concentrating on a single intention, evoking that energy. So I'm using the Akadua, let's say, extra form of energy. And I also think that's probably an important thing, is that we have access to all these different forms of energies and types of power that these older magicians did not. So yes, maybe they're not able to connect to any of those things. They're not aware of the subtle energies like we are today. It's crazy. I just talk to like friends and like, oh yeah, it's that. It we are different human beings. Even if you're of an older generation or like me, I was born in 1982, you know, like a little bit of that, it's fine because the universe is changing as well. Or not just the universe, but this whole sphere, this ethosphere, you know. Um, so I think that maybe a lot of old magicians did not have access, could not have, they didn't have the sensitivity. Um, Sri Yukteswar used to say, he used to call them the subtle electricities. This is before we were using the word energies to refer to this type of stuff in English. So he was writing in English and Hindi or Sanskrit, yeah, one of those Indian languages, the one that he spoke, and translating it also into English, because English was the language and still is mostly of science. And he was trying to merge the science and the spiritual stuff. You know, he wrote the book, The Spiritual Science. Um, and he was convinced that the cycle of yugas was, in fact, a product of the Kali Yuga. So all of these huge numbers of astrological time were basically bunk. They were basically put into the canons of the scriptures to keep people from knowing the actual truth, which is that the Yuga cycle is much shorter and gets shorter and shorter and shorter as it goes along, much like the Mayan calendar and all these things. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You get it? And that whole thing was a product of the Kali Yuga, and that we were already out of the Kali Yuga, and people were getting smarter. It was talking about the liberation of man and this independence and freedom and of choice and liberty and all that stuff and equality. That was not a thing in the last several centuries. You know, people were not trying to do that as much. That's his ideas. Maybe you don't agree. There's some things, like he even mentions Napoleon. I'm like, not the best example, bruh, but whatever. Um, and that men or humans back then were not aware of the subtle electricities, and that they would start to have knowledge of that. What are we doing, you guys? Like, everybody's talking about energy all the time. I hear it even in, you know, shows that I watch. I'm like, oh, I have access to these, you know, subtle energies. I'm like, nobody would have known what that meant even 50 years ago, you know? It's crazy. Anyway, so now that we have access to this in our bodies, our spirits, whatever you want to call it, the form of human that we are becoming has so much easier access to these energies now. I can pull them from anywhere. You know, I've said that for a long time. When I really started to switch on and do my own practices and open up to channeling and all this stuff, it was like, I can channel any energy ever. Like, how is this a thing? You know, people would say, "Oh, can I give you a Reiki attunement?" I'm like, "I don't need it. I give it to myself." Like, you tell me what kind of Reiki you have, and I will pull it, and I will start channeling it to you right now. Not a problem. You know. So we're different, and I think that all of that stuff that I talked about, and the sacrifice, and the extra energy, and having to have this egoic battle with spirits and entities and different types of consciousnesses in order to vie for more magical power, I think it's all done. Also, just to wrap up, there's nothing wrong with working with spirits. There's nothing wrong with working for them for extra types of power, as long as you just open up to that power and feel it yourself. You know what I mean? This is not, again, an egoic battle in which I'm binding the spirit to my will and forcing it to use its power instead of mine. That's another thing. It's like our reserves of actual energy, I think, were a lot more difficult to replenish back then. And so a magician, yeah, you're going to, like any witch or person who's done a ritual or whatever, like afterwards you might be like, whoa, gotta lie down for a bit, you know, that kind of thing. That doesn't happen so much when you have access to all this other energy. So that being said, working with spirits can be invigorating. It can be healing. This is why now there are all of these people who are connecting up to these higher energies and higher spirits and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and God forms or whatever and fairies, which are somewhat, you know, more into this like astral, energetic, earthy stuff that we exist on, somehow closer to the third dimensional level, whatever. And that I don't think there's anything wrong with having that. There's a problem with relying on them all the time and constantly giving them the idea that we are less than them or whatever. Even the God forms can be jealous of us because it is more difficult for a God form to evolve and reach transcendence than it is for us, because we're constantly bombarded and reminded that, oh, I need to do better, oh, I need to stop doing that, I need to do this. They're just sitting up there on their golden thrones, just, you know, enthralled in bliss. In a lot of Hindus and yogic teachers will tell you this kind of thing, that those god forms, they just stay there. They're fine, they're happy, they're not going to move, they're not going to change very often. It's very difficult for those types of consciousnesses to evolve. And so we have it better than they do, even though we have it a lot more, even though it's a lot more difficult down at this level. You know, in some ways, people call this a hell. We are on the lowest rung of this consciousness existence. And so it's very difficult for us to get up there, obviously, but we have a choice and we have the awareness. These other things that are just sitting up there in like constant bliss don't even get the notion that that they need to move or change or grow or evolve or transcend or awaken or whatever. Okay, so enough about that. So don't set that up that, oh, I'm less than you, Angel Michael, whatever, you know, just like merge, become the Archangel Michael, you know. And as long as that consciousness is something that you are absolutely aware is pure and good and aligned with spirit or whatever, I don't think there's really anything to be afraid of. You know, I've talked about relying on spirits or relying on channeling and all that kind of stuff. The only way I really mean it now is just like, don't rely on the information that is obviously coming through your own personal filter. You know, just connect with them. That's enough. It's more than enough. It's better that way, I think. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, using that kind of stuff, connecting with spirits for different forms of power, but you are an equal in a lot of ways. You are partners in a lot of ways. Even if you're like, okay, wow, your consciousness is like 6 billion times brighter than mine, you're working with an angel or a bright spirit or whatever, um, you know, just don't set it up in your mind that you're completely less than, because they need you. They need you in order to experience things on these levels. Again, difficult for them to come down. It's more difficult for them to come down than it is for us to simply open. Think about that. So, different styles competing, old paradigm, new paradigm. I'm really into the idea that we don't need to worry as much. Yet I don't want to discaution. I don't know if that's a word. I don't want to say, it's no big deal. Just go and try it, baby. Whatever. You know, you might summon Satan, but who cares? No, not really. Um, I just don't think it's as chaotic and crazy as it once was. My experience with it has been constantly reassuring. You know, I'll do someone else's type of ritual, and that's not reassuring because I have absolutely no connections to these things. And so I tried that, and I was so getting into it and like inflaming myself in the ritual, and then completely abandoned it later because I was like, this isn't even. It's not mine. You know, I'm using all these names of God and stuff. I'm like, I don't care about the Hebrew God, which is actually a Canaanite God, by the way. I'm like, it's not working for me. And then nothing happens. I spend 2 minutes just intending, and this is a real experience from just a couple weeks ago. I started doing this just every once in a while. I started getting lonely, you know? And I'm like, okay, well, I want somebody who doesn't suck. Like, literally, I just want, like, a friend who feels like a friend. It's so few and far between out here, and I'll go out and I'll end up sitting, you know, like, drinking a couple beers. Nah, I'll have another one. And I end up talking to some stupid straight guy who, like, won't even look me in the eye. I'm like, ugh, fuck this. So I just started doing, like, okay, I just want somebody that I can talk to. I swear to God, man, like, that night I just did this, and I'm focusing and putting my intention, and I'm using the Akadwa and like push that energy out there. It's a very simple process, and it's rather like meditating now, you know. So it's exactly the same as the manifestation and focusing on the thing that you want. You put that intention in there, and as long as you can focus on it enough and put enough energy towards it, then it will manifest in a real and exciting and not dangerous way. At least, again, there's all this stuff in between, and all of the spiritual traditions will say, don't try to do this stuff if you haven't reached a level of spiritual merit. But basically, it's like, don't be a dick. You know, like, if you're going to do these things and you're going to manifest for something, it's like, well, I really want to show her something. You know, like, no, you can't do it from the level of pettiness or jealousy, or even the reaction stuff can be way more dangerous because it opens you up to this, like, vulnerability, you know, the space of vulnerability and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, oh god, I'm gonna lose my house. Like, that's not a good position to do magic in. If you can turn it around and use all of that and focus that, then that's powerful magics. But that's advanced stuff, you know. The process of self-editing, confession. Examine all of your intentions and why. Why am I having this desire? Is it really attached to something else that's not so pure? And for me, every time I sit in front of my space and I start to intend or try to manifest something, then I am in that space. I have decided a long time ago that nothing is going to be intended that is not, and nothing is going to manifest that I have intended that isn't pure, right? So if I get it wrong and I'm not paying attention, nothing's going to happen anyway. End of story, right? This is the type of stuff that you have to set up for yourself. Also, banishing and clearing space, way more powerful anything that you do in that space, even if it's just a mental space or emotional or whatever. It's going to be way more powerful, and you're going to have way better results, and there's going to be way less of a possibility that anything unsavory is going to attach itself to that intention, right? And it doesn't just mean from an external source, it means from in here, you know. That's where the editing comes in. Okay, so there was one other thing I wanted to do, just because I thought it was funny, because I just decided to watch The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and I thought that there were some interesting points in it, you know, when it comes to, first of all, in the later episodes, no spoilers, she starts mentioning subtle energies, or different types of spiritual energies, and I just thought that was interesting that it was talking about energy, you know, because up till then, they don't. It's all incantations and sympathetic magic, you know, so winding a thing around a doll or a stick, or, you know, intending somebody's going to do something and then tying a rope or whatever, and that is the That's sort of like the physical manifestation. If you can connect your intention to that physical act, then that knot becomes knot magic is really popular all around the world, you know, in tribal societies especially. So you're tying something again, you're binding something, you're making it happen on a physical level while also having this sort of meditative connection to it. Sometimes the incantation is the way that you get into that space without having to get into that space. So a spell is a mantra, obviously. It's the same thing. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting about that series, I think, is in the very first episode, and she has to pick a familiar, and it's like, familiar is a tool. It's just a thing, you know. It's like you bind to your will so that you can have extra power and go and do whatever you want to do and that kind of stuff. Apparently, my familiars are fruit flies. I don't know why. I'm kidding. And she's like, no, no. I'd rather have a partner. I'd rather have an equal. And so, you know, obviously, whether they're doing this on purpose or not, it's there story wise. They're doing it on purpose. Sabrina represents one of the new children. She's half witch and half mortal, right? Everybody knows that. Again, no spoilers. Um, so she represents the new children. She represents the new paradigm. She doesn't want to bind these spirits to her. She doesn't want to force them to do her will and her bidding and, you know, have all this extra power in a sort of sense of slavery. You're enslaving these forces in order to carry out your magical will, and she doesn't want that. So she goes to the forest and she entreats the forest spirits and any, you know, goblins or whatever that might be out there that want to assist her, and she asks them to be her partner, and then nothing happens. And then later, of course, something heeds her call and she gets her familiar, you know. And they're always like that through the whole series. They're just companions, they're just equals. It has nothing to do with binding this consciousness to yours or forcing it to do anything that it doesn't want to do, you know. I'll leave you with that. I think it's good stuff.